יהיו לרצון אמרי פי ויגון ליבי לפניך, השם צורי וגואלי. It's a great honor, and I'm a little bit anxious and nervous, but I will do my best. So, the question I was asked to speak about, can there be a non-Christian Europe? If we take a cultural criterion, a cultural perspective, the question seems almost silly. In any big or small European town or village, you see the imprint of Christianity in art, in architecture, in literature, in poetry, even in political culture. Those who are opposed to Christianity, in some way, it's a dialectical relationship with Christianity. So, from that cultural perspective, the answer is, at least for a very, very long time, one cannot imagine a non-Christian Europe. It's just so deeply rooted in our cultural heritage. But maybe that's not the right criterion, because if I look at the criterion that I just mentioned, the cultural, and I wanted to be rude, so please forgive me, it's almost Europe today, and you all know that Poland is the exception. It's like a museum of Christianity, of a past. Because another criterion would be, is there a critical mass, not even a majority, just a critical mass of practicing Christians in Europe who accept the Lordship of Jesus Christ? The answer is demoralizing. Do you know how many people in France go regularly to Mass? France, la fille de l'Église, 5 to 7%. So we can say France is a laïc country. The United Kingdom has an established Christian church, the Church of England. Every weekend there are more Muslims in mosques than there are Christians in churches. And in a way, that is the reality. The French Catholic philosopher Chantal del Sol said, we live in a post-Constantine Europe. Now, what does it mean? It's not only the numbers that have changed, this rapid secularization of Europe over the last 50, 60, 70 years. And if I can drop a footnote, it's scary. If you take an Italian 11-year-old or 12-year-old or 13-year-old, or a French 11-year-old or 12-year-old or 13-year-old, and you imagine them going to the Prado, to the Uffizi, to the Louvre, they will be looking in the Renaissance room where practically every painting has in dialogue with the gospel, and they will not know what they're looking at. It's as if a Japanese tourist came to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam and looked at the famous Rembrandt, The Binding of Isaac, The Sacrifice of Isaac, and wouldn't know what he or she are looking at. They never read the book of Genesis. But to think that our youth today could be in a similar situation, as I say, is demoralizing. But it goes even deeper. In 2003, that's 21 years ago, I published a little book. It has also been translated into Polish, called A Christian Europe. And what prompted me to write that book was what I considered to be a scandal in the drafting of the proposed European Constitution. Because when they drafted the preamble, you know, the sort of solemn, magisterial introduction to the Constitution, it began with the reference to Thucydides, the tradition of Athens. But when it was proposed in referring to the roots of Europe, to refer to the Christian tradition, it was refused. And the French said, if you make a reference to Christianity in the preamble to the Constitution of Europe, there will be no constitution. Now, can I tell a funny story? I met with the architect of the Constitution, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. We were at dinner with a few foreign ministers, you know, important people. I was the smallest person in the room. And he looked at me and he said, but you know, Professor, we decided they will adopt the Constitution by consensus, and there was no consensus to make a reference to the Christian roots of Europe. And I looked at him and said, but Mr. President, you drafted the preamble. You could have made a reference to the Christian roots of Europe, and there would not have been a consensus to take it out. So it would stay in. And he looked at me and said, Professor, vous êtes méchante. You are nasty. But that's a funny story. But it underlies what I'm trying to say, that the problem is not just the decline of practicing Christians, Catholics in Europe. It's a change in the political culture. To imagine that you would be happy to put in a reference to the tradition of Athens and would not put in a reference to the tradition of Jerusalem and Rome. And that's why I wrote that book, A Christian Europe. Now, when I wrote that book 21 years ago, I gave lots of illustration of what I called Christophobia. When I look at Europe of today, there's still Christophobia, but there's something different. There's ignorance and indifference. And it's hard for me to decide what is worse, Christophobia. At least you know what you're hating, what you're afraid of, or ignorance and indifference. I said, Chantal del Sol said, we live in a post-Constantine Europe. So unlike the pre-Constantine Europe, they are not throwing the Christians to the lions. But it's not only because we don't do that anymore, it's because they don't care. So the question we really have to face, and by we, if you allow me, Your Eminence, I mean people of faith. How do we, what Ratzinger said, a minority but a creative minority, how do we operate in a secular Europe, in a Europe which is in some way not just laïque, but laïciste, where secularity becomes a new form of religion? How should we behave? What should be our reaction in that kind of environment? I'm not the first to ask this question. And one answer that has been given in the United States by a Catholic, I'm not sure I would call him a theologian, but a man of influence, he said, Christian, we should close in within ourselves. We should take care of our community, protect our heritage, teach our children, but distance ourselves from the secular world. And he even added, like the Jews, they have been a minority for thousands of years, and despite everything, they managed to survive. And they survived because they were inward looking, taking care of their own community. With respect, with great respect, I don't think that's a Christian option. Because Christianity is an evangelizing religion. It's a universal message. It's a lesson to the whole world. So the option of just closing within a Christian community, I really don't think that is an option for Christians. It's a betrayal of this evangelizing mission of offering salvation to everybody. So how should we be in this post-Constantine, not just secular, but sometimes hostile, laicist world? So I'm going to move in 3-4 ways. The first is to say that we are all children of the French Revolution. And in many ways, we should be happy that we are children of the French Revolution. Human rights, although in a deep sense emanating, as even Saint Habermas will now acknowledge from the Christian tradition, is a gift of the French Revolution. And one of the fundamental human rights is freedom of religion. But the way we understand freedom of religion, everybody, in every country, in every constitution, in every court, freedom of religion also means freedom from religion. In other words, a religious person should not be impeded to live his or her faith, but if you are not religious, you should not be coerced into religion. You should not be forced to be religion, as exists in some countries in the world, as we know. That is a heritage of the French Revolution. Now, there's a problem for liberal theory. We all intuitively understand freedom of religion, but how does liberal theory explain freedom from religion? If you have a socialist government, we live in democracies. That is our new holy trinity: democracy, human rights, the rule of law. We live in democracies, and if there's a majority of socialists, there will be socialist policies. We might not like it, but that's what democracy means. We might hope to win the next election. If there's a majority of neoliberals, I might be a socialist, I might not like it, but I live in a democracy. I expect that there will be neoliberal policies. But if there's a majority of Christians, we are told, no, there cannot be Christian policies because that violates freedom from religion. So no freedom from socialism, no freedom from neoliberalism, but freedom from Christianity, yes. Liberal theory has great difficulty in explaining this. There are all kinds of explanations, but there's also a fundamental right to have supper in time, so I don't want to be too long. So they are not convincing in my view. Let's leave that in the air a minute, that liberal theory has a problem of explaining why there should be freedom from religion when there's no freedom from neoliberalism or freedom from socialism. But there's a deeper critique by the great American political scientist or political theorist, one of the greatest of the 20th century, John Rawls. Please bear with me, a little bit of patience. Say, cierpliwość. Is that patience? Cierpliwość? Cierpliwość. John Rawls said, there's something that is essential for democracy, that transcends difference between the right and the left. To have a functioning democracy, it has to operate by the rules of reason. That there can be a dialogue between people who disagree, and one side wins the dialogue by reason, and then you have to accept it. You can't say, well, I don't like 2 and 2 is 4, for me 2 and 2 is 5. No, it doesn't work that way. But then he went on to say, and that's why we can't have religion, but he meant Christianity, as part of the democratic game. Why? Because Christians, and that is true, have non-negotiable truths. You are not willing to negotiate them. No matter what you say to them, we believe Jesus lived, he was crucified, he was resurrected. He was the Son of the Almighty offering salvation to the world. That's a non-negotiable position. And Rawls said, if that's how you come into the public space, you cannot be part of democratic discourse, which is based on reason. So we have two challenges. One is, how do we explain freedom from religion? And how do we justify that Christians will be part of the political game? The most convincing answer to both these questions was, strangely enough, given by Joseph Ratzinger, by Pope Benedict XVI, in his famous lectures in Paris and in London and in the Bundestag and in Munich. And what did he say? You remember when he gave his lecture in Regensburg, Ratisbona, there was a huge fracas. Excuse me. Why was there a huge fracas? Because he talked about the most fundamental freedom being freedom of religion. But in that lecture, he insisted on freedom from religion. And he criticized Muslim countries who do not respect freedom from religion. And that's why there was such a brouhaha. He was right, of course. But the reason he justified freedom from religion was a religious reason, not a liberal one. And it was very simple, intuitive. The minute you hear it, you have to agree with it. Now I'm putting words into his mouth. He said, if you do not say yes to God freely by your free choice, it is worthless in the eyes of God. God wants people, free human beings, as he created them, who to say, I have listened. This is covenantal Abrahamic monotheism. Here is my offer. I can say yes, I can say no, and freely I say yes. If it's coerced, it has no religious significance. It is not welcome in the eyes of the Almighty. The most convincing reason for freedom from religion is a religious reasoning, because coerced religion is not pleasant in the eyes of the Lord. That's Ratzinger. Then he deals with Rawls without ever mentioning him by name. And he says, I agree with Rawls that the basic rule of the game in democracy has to be reason. What Rawls did not understand, he did not understand Christianity. Because when the Christian goes into the public space and advocates a position that, for example, could become law and bind all people, he never does, or he should never do it, on the basis of revelation. Only on the basis of reason. I give you an easy example. The 10 Commandments say, thou shalt not kill. In fact, it says, thou shalt not murder, lo tirtzach. That means you don't kill the innocent. When the Christian goes into the public arena, mobilizes parliament, etc., he said we should have in our country a law which says murder is prohibited and will be punished. But he should not say that's because it's written in the 10 Commandments. He says because that is natural law. You don't need revelation. in order to understand that murdering should be prohibited. When the Christian goes in, it might also be the command of God. But that's not the reason you plead in the public space, says Ratzinger. You plead it based on natural law, something that you can tell an atheist, you don't have to accept revelation. You don't have to accept God. But in terms of natural reasoning of a human being, you can understand that murder can be prohibited. And he said, that is what Rawls did not understand. Now, I will come back to this in a few minutes, and maybe I will need a bodyguard, because I might say something provocative. But we will wait. I'm just teasing. So now we understood something important. We understood that freedom from religion is a religious proposition, that a religious person believes in freedom from religion, not only freedom of religion, because that's what our faith demands of us. So now let's go back to the French Revolution. And we also saw that we do have a legitimate place in the public square, so long as our positions, they might be also in Scripture, 10 Commandments, thou shalt not murder, but that's not the argument we make in Parliament. In Parliament we say that is based on reason, that is natural law. Now I want to explain what I think are two errors that we inherited from the French Revolution, and that, to my sadness, I think many religious people have internalized, and they should not. The first one is the French Revolution proposition enshrined in the French Constitution that religion is a private affair. If you want to be religious, of course, we protect your freedom of religion, but that is your private matter. You can do it in your house, you can do it in your church, but not in a public space. And in addition, there's the era of neutrality. What is the era of neutrality? That secularism is a neutral position. That sounds abstract. I will give you an example, a real example. So in Italian schools, to this day, in Italian primary schools, there is a requirement by law to display a crucifix. So in every Italian public school, not just a private Catholic school, in every Italian public school, in the first 6 years, when a student goes to class, there will be a crucifix on the wall. So there was an Italian lady who went to court and said, I'm an atheist. Why should my child have to be in a classroom and stare at a crucifix? And it eventually got to the highest jurisdiction in Europe, the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, to a chamber, 7 judges. And they ruled 7-0 against Italy. And what was their reasoning? It says the state has a duty of neutrality. It cannot take sides. And if it requires a crucifix on the wall, it is taking sides with Christianity. And that is not neutral. 7-0. It was my privilege to argue before the Grand Chamber, that's 17 judges of the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, pro bono. I believed in what I was saying. And I explained to the judges the error that neutrality, that secular is neutral. And I gave the following example from the field of education. I said, Let's imagine two little boys. Let's call one Leonardo, like Leonardo da Vinci, and the other one we'll call Marco, like the Gospel. The little Leonardo, these two kids, next week they're going for their first day in school, in primary school. And Leonardo goes to the house of Marco to visit him. And he enters in the house and he sees a crucifix on the wall. And he says to his friend Marco, "What's that?" And Marco looks at him and says, "You mean to say you live in a house without a crucifix? How can you live in a house without a crucifix?" Poor little Leonardo runs home crying to his mother and says, "We don't have a crucifix, we have to have a crucifix." And his mother says, "It's okay, these are our friends, they are Catholic, we respect them. But we have our code of moral conduct, you can be okay about it." The next day, Marco visits Leonardo. And he comes into the house and he says, "Hey, where's your crucifix?" And Leonardo says to Marco, "Crucifix? Only stupid people believe in that. Old wives' tale." And little Marco runs to his mother and says, "Why do we have a crucifix? Only stupid people believe in that." Now comes the crux. The next day they both go to school. Hypothesis number one, there's a crucifix on the wall. Little Leonardo runs home and tells his mother, "You see, also the school has a crucifix." Hypothesis number two, there's no crucifix on the wall. Marco runs to his mother and says, "You see, also the school doesn't have a crucifix." Neither having one nor not having one is neutral. A state like France can decide to be laïque, but don't tell me that laïcité is neutral. A state like the United Kingdom can decide to have an established church, like Denmark, who has an established church, like Malta, like Greece. We can respect it. It's not neutral. Secularity is not neutral. So what we have to do, if we live in Italy and there's a crucifix on the wall, we have to teach our children to respect people who are not Catholic or who might have other religions. And what we have to do in France, where there's no crucifix on the wall, is to teach children to respect people who are religious and believe in the crucifix. But we should not tell them that secularity is neutral. It's a choice. I continue the educational example to show you what is true neutrality. In the United States, the state, there is free education, but the state will only fund secular schools. And if you want to send your kid to a Catholic school, you have to pay. The parents have to fund the school because the state says we are neutral. We cannot fund a Catholic school. We cannot fund a Jewish school. There are two countries which really understand the true nature of neutrality, the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. In the United Kingdom, they say the state should be neutral. So they will fund secular public schools, Catholic public schools, Protestant public schools, Jewish public schools, Muslim public schools. That's true neutrality. We have to not fall into the trap of believing that secularism is neutral. It's a respectable choice, but neutral it is not. Here is the second error that we took from the French Revolution. It's the private thing, right? The private thing. So, does the private thing mean that there can be no manifestation of our collective identity as a religious community? If that were true, it would mean that you would have to change the British anthem, God Save the King. It's out of the hymn book. How can you have a hymn as your national anthem? We would have to not read the Irish Constitution in public because in the preamble it says, truth, beauty, and justice come from the Holy Trinity. Out. We would have to remove the cross from the British flag, from the Danish flag, from the Swiss flag. Every flag that has a cross, it had to go out. We have to understand something. All our states have to respect at an individual level freedom of religion and freedom from religion. You cannot be discriminated because you are religious. You cannot be discriminated because you are not religious. But in our collective identity, most people in England are secular. But if you told them we should change the anthem, we cannot sing any longer God Save the King, they would laugh in your face. They would say, that's part of who we are. Can you imagine an island without a Catholic tradition? For centuries they fought against Protestant Britain because they were Catholic. Can you just take it out of their collective identity? So as long as you respect freedom of religion and freedom from religion, it violates the international legal principle to collective self-determination to say that a state cannot celebrate its history and its culture if it has religious themes to it. We expect a Muslim country to have a crescent in their flag. We expect a Jewish state to have a Star of David. And if a Christian state wants to have a cross, God bless them. We should not stop that, as long as at the individual level they respect the fundamental human rights to freedom of religion, freedom from religion. Now comes the difficult part of my lecture, because I think so far you could say this makes sense. Remember that my theme was, how does a religious people in a post-Constantine Europe, a religious Christian, have to behave? So I apologize, Your Eminence, if I will be a little bit critical of some of your flock, with you being the shepherd. I have taught in many European universities. I've taught in the Sorbonne, I've taught in Berlin at the Hertie School, I've taught at Oxford, I've taught at La Sapienza in Madrid. I've really, when people ask me, what are you? I never say I'm a scholar. I always say I'm a humble teacher. That's my vocation. I know so many colleagues, professors in these universities, and I would never guess that they are practicing Catholics. They internalize this French notion, you're religious in your private sphere, but when you're in the public sphere, you hide it. I apologize. They're living like Marranos. Those were the Jews who had to convert to Christianity and had to hide their Jewishness after 1492. I find that troubling. I find that unnecessary. Why should you be almost embarrassed in public? And I know that Poland is the exception, but you have to remember Poland is the exception. That people will know your religious identity. That young people can look up and say, he's a Catholic teacher, he's not ashamed of it. It's hard for me to grasp that. Now, the prophet Micah said, what does God demand of us? But to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. Walk humbly, but not hidden. There's a difference to be humble and to hide your religious identity. And I find that ubiquitous. So how do we have to behave in a post-Constantine Europe? One thing we should not do is to hide our religious commitment. humbly doesn't mean you go proselytizing, etc., but you lead by testimony, by people looking up to you and saying, that is admirable. But they will never say that is admirable if they don't even know that you are a practicing religious person. So that's my first thing. The second thing is more complicated and more challenging. You remember that when I went back to the critique of Ratzinger of John Rawls, I said he doesn't understand Christianity. Because when the Christian goes into the public place, he only advocates positions that are not based on revelation, that are based on natural law. And if he does that, or if she does that, it's totally okay. Because I'm saying thou shalt not murder, not because it's in the Ten Commandments, but because it's natural law. That position is very seductive, because that's the visa of the Christian to go into the public space. So it's very seductive to say my religious commitment is actually natural law. Now, we have to be careful there, because if we say that something is natural law and it's really based on revelation, we are committing a religious sin. We are forcing people to follow a revelation, a religious precept, and not a natural law reason. So drawing the line, what is natural law and what is not natural law, is very critical, because it's so seductive for us to pretend that everything is natural law, and therefore we have a visa to say the state should follow it. I'm going to give you two examples. One, I expect you will agree with me, and one, I will probably be the only room in the room that will agree with myself. Let's look at divorce. In the 1970s of the last century, so it's 50 years ago, it's certainly within my lifetime and probably the lifetime of some of the people living here, there was a referendum in Italy whether divorce should be legalized. And the church campaigned against it. The church would have every person in Italy not being able to divorce, even if he's a Protestant who accept divorce, even if he's a Jew or Muslim who accept divorce, even if he's an atheist who got married before the mayor in civil marriage, no divorce. And some of the arguments were saying that is natural law. Marriage is for life. In my view, it was a mistake. It wasn't only a political mistake because they lost the referendum. It was a religious mistake, because the prohibition of divorce, it's one of the innovations of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. In the Old Testament, divorce was allowed. There are elaborate rules about divorce. It's not natural law, but I want to say something deeper. I always think, how do I educate my children? I have 5 children. They're not children anymore, so now I have 4 grandchildren. How do I educate my grandchildren? One of the most powerful things, when my kid says, why can't we eat a cheeseburger? It's not kosher. It looks so tasty. I don't say to them, because it's against natural law, because it's unhealthy, because it's not tasty. I say there's only one reason, because the Lord commanded us, and we are Jewish and bound by that old covenant. I think it's more powerful for a parent to tell their Catholic child, why can't we divorce? Why can't you divorce? Whereas my friend, their parents are Protestant, can divorce. And the answer is because that's what the Lord commanded us, because we are Catholics. And that's how we understand in a special way marriage. It's not just a contract between man and woman, it's a contract between man, God, and woman. And it's indissoluble. When we put everything in natural law, we lose the ability to underline the specificity of our faith, because everybody is bound by natural law. Now comes my controversial example. I want to talk about homosexuality. If you want same-sex marriage. And those who oppose it say it's contrary to natural law. And I want to challenge that. And I want to explain to you why I challenge that. So please be patient. Again, cierpliwość. There are two strands in natural law. One is the natural law that is based on ethics. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not torture. Thou shalt not lie. We can argue what ethics teaches us, but the basis of that part of natural law is morality and ethics. The second strand in natural law, it's what based on nature. There are men and women. The natural position is to be heterosexual. This is where I differ from many of my colleagues. The argument based on nature, deep down, is a religious argument. The only reason you can take a normative position based on nature is if you believe the world was created by God, that it had a purpose, that God created men and women with a certain purpose in mind, that God created sexuality with a certain purpose in mind. It's a deeply religious position. In my view, it's a noble religious position to understand that the world didn't just emerge from a big bang, but there was a creator who created with the telos and expected human beings to live in a certain way. But there is no reason for a non-religious person to see any normative moral value in nature. He can say, it just happened. I followed the rules of physics, which tell me that day follows night, that the earth goes around the sun and not the sun around the earth. But otherwise, there's no moral purpose in simple nature. There's only purpose if you believe in God, the Creator. And if I'm right in this argument, and of course you can imagine that not all my colleagues on natural law agree with my position, then our attitude towards homosexuality or towards safe self-marriage, I tell my children why we don't do it, why it's wrong, because God commanded us. But if other people, if it's two adults, if they agree, if they're not harming anybody, that's their life. It's not our life, because we are different in this respect. Because we are following imitatio Dei, but I don't want to force it on them. And if I see two women go to the town hall and get married, how do I feel? I feel, I hope they have a happy life. What else should I feel? I wish them good. Should I hate them? So I told you I will be the only person in the room. But remember where I come from. We have to draw very carefully the line between revelation and natural law. And I gave you one example where I think you agreed with me, divorce. You would not want to force divorce on people who are not Catholic. And one example where you disagreed with me, but it's a challenge. It's worth thinking on. I come to a close, Your Eminence. And I come to a close, I go back to Ratzinger. And I go back to Ratisbon, to Regensburg, but not to the lecture, to the homily. And there was a huge, wonderful lesson in the homily, where Ratzinger talked about the royal law. And I'm going to make it very concise because I've talked too much. You cannot...
Not according to the natural law.
You can't be... We strive for holiness. Holiness does not have a meaning in a secular worldview. It has no meaning. It's purely a religious concept. If you're an atheist, if you're secular, you don't even understand what is meant by holiness. And God bless you. The sacred belongs to the world of faith. The sacred. And what Ratzinger said, he said, the path to holiness, of course, is based on morality. You cannot be an immoral person. You cannot be a sinner. You cannot be a liar. You cannot be a murderer and believe that you can be holy or that you can strive for holy. But he said something more. He said, but it's a necessary condition to the path to holiness. It's not a sufficient condition. The sacraments are important. Prayer is important. The Eucharist is important. That's not morality. That's part of the path to holiness. And once again, forgive me, especially young people, when I ask them, what to you does it mean to be a Christian? They say, I have to be a moral person. And I say to them, of course you have to be a moral person. But is that all? How does that make you different from your friend who's not a Catholic and is a moral person? Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.